But here's, and I've said this to the Europeans all along, to every single one of them. We're not your friends. We're not your friends. America doesn't exist to be your friends. In the mindset of old America, you exist to do what we tell you to do. You're our tool. We use you as a tool. We'll play you off against other tools. But what's the purpose of a tool? To do its job until it breaks. And then when it breaks, we just throw you away and we get another tool. This isn't about making Europe great. You exist only to facilitate America being made great again. That's a reality. Okay, we don't care about you at all. There is zero compassion in the American enterprise towards Europe, towards any nation out there. We only care about America. And even Donald Trump, in his the new approach he takes, just look at the name of the political movement that he leads. Make America great again. There's no room in that for India, for Europe, for anybody else, unless you are helping make America great again. So we have to artificially boost the American economy by keeping a war footing in a non-war environment. And that's what the Cold War was all about, creating the perception of constant conflict and sometimes the reality of conflict to generate war-based manufacturing. But the difference this time is trying to break free of a fundamentally flawed paradigm, and that is the military-industrial complex paradigm that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about, the post-World War II situation where in order to keep our economy going so we don't drift back into the Great Depression, again, study historical timelines and understand that in the mid-1930s, America was a nation in economic and social collapse. It took the World War to bring us out of it because we were able to create giant industries, mobilize the industrial base, and make the arsenal of democracy. But then the war ended. And what do you do with the arsenal of democracy? If you deconstruct it too fast, we go back into the same fundamental flawed economic principles that brought the Depression. I cannot tell you that Europe is all bad and America is all good. That's just an outright lie. In fact, in the post-war reconstruction of Europe, we used Europe as a tool to promote American global hegemony. We used the reconstruction of Europe, and then we helped manufacture a artificial existential crisis with the Soviet Union to justify the restoration of militarism in Europe through the vehicle of NATO. But we made sure that we dominated NATO, that we were in charge, that we directed NATO. But then the Soviet Union collapsed and we didn't have a plan B. And what happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union is that America sought to retain control, hegemonic control economically. Look what we do with the G7. If you can't be a thinking person and don't understand the goal of the G7 is for the United States to dominate post-World War global economy, both in the Pacific and in Europe, especially in Europe. We also did the same thing in promoting the creation of the European Union. That was the notion of a unified Europe, the economic aspects of which would be responsive to the United States, the same as NATO expansion responsive to, or NATO responsive to the United States. And this worked. It's evil genius. It worked. And then through NATO, we sought to expand our reach. The G20 becomes about global economic domination, and NATO starts itching to get into a fight with places that have nothing to do with North Atlantic. In Libya, I remember I attended a NATO conference in the United Arab Emirates where they were talking about setting up a NATO presence in the Middle East. NATO was going to make the Middle East its little baby. North Africa was going to become part of that too. And then, the Pacific now. So NATO became this global tool of American hegemony. Europe, though, becomes empowered by this. I am capable of doing this myself. And Europe's not. And they're about ready to find the harshest of harsh lessons. Because when America unplugs, and we are going to unplug, and we're going to do it in a way Europe can't even imagine, because they've bought in the notion that we're their friends. No, Europe, you've never been our friend. Never been our friend. You are a tool. What about the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States? You do understand that Roosevelt was, first of all, he sucked the life out of your economy, took all of your gold, took all of your bases, and then said, when the war's over, I'm dismantling your empire. Is that how a friend works? No, you are a tool and you get used as a tool. Europe can't function that way. Europe has become the the monster. We created this monster. We thought we could control it. We thought we could keep them caged up and go, okay, bomb Libya. We'll go bomb Libya for you. All right, let's go take out Afghan. I want you to occupy Afghanistan instead of going, why Afghanistan? Yes, we're going to go in and do nation building in a part of the world we know nothing about and doomed, therefore, to fail. We want you to send troops to Iraq to do what? Okay, we're going to do that too. And then Ukraine comes up, this whole thing. Europe is incapable of doing anything. And I'm just saying that straight up without America. Europe cannot function without America. And when we unplug, Europe will die. This will be one of the cultural catastrophes of modern history. Europe as a global power will cease to exist. They've already moved down the path of deindustrialization. They're never going to get that up. And if they want to go to war with America, an economic war, we can collapse the German economy, which is the heartbeat of Europe, overnight. Overnight. Why don't they realize that? Europe can't collapse us. We can collapse Europe. And now it'll still exist. And if you can afford it, you can take a plane to Paris and look at the Eiffel Tower. I'm sure the French will have enough money to make it sparkle at night. And you can go to London and look at Big Ben. And you can go to Rome and go to the Colosseum. You can go to Berlin and look at the Reichstag. Europe's got a whole bunch of really cool, but Europe will become nothing more than a glorified tourist destination. I think you're going to see that the next century is going to be defined by the new big four. And that is the United States, Russia, China, and India sitting down and telling Europe, you're not invited to this. Go make your bed and breakfast, because that's what Europe's going to become, a glorified bed and breakfast where people can go and visit and listen to quaint accents. But that's it. Europe's not a power. It's nothing. It'll be done. That's cool. It's not perfect. I can't guarantee that everything's going to come up smelling like roses. What's the best thing about it? In the United States is changing its outlook, where we enter the lead foot that we take isn't the military foot, it's the economic foot. And as soon as you start talking about the economy, you know what you do? You humanize this. War is about killing. Hopefully, can train the next generation of people who lead economically, which means when I sit down with you, I'm asking you how to put food into the bellies of my family, and you're asking me how to put food into the bellies of your family. And now we agree on something. We're not trying to kill each other. We're trying to nurture each other. We're trying to make life livable. The big four are going to be governing, and that's the transition that's taking place here. And we're going to go off and deal with real people. And this is the genius of Trump. Because when we sit down with people, it's not the relation between master and servant, equals. When we sit down with Modi, it's not the relationship between craftsman and tool, equals. When we sit down with China, we still have to fix this Chinese relationship, but we will. It'll be as equals. We need to tell the military, you don't get to call the shots. And if we choose to have a military, it's going to be a military that is sized appropriately, because the way we interface with the world today is through diplomats and businessmen. We don't send the generals out to represent us anymore. And I also think that the big four are going to redefine the global relationships. Why? The United Nations was a product of war, and the United Nations is a construct of war. The Security Council is the lead element in the United Nations. If the United Nations was reflective of the genuine requirements of humanity, we would lead with the social, economic, and food aspect of it. They would be the number one players. The Security Council would be this minor little adjunct, but instead we lead with the Security Council, which talks about war, military force. We need to change that paradigm. The British are a joke right now. They're actively trying to sabotage everything Donald Trump's trying to do, and Donald Trump is a counter puncher. He's also a man with thin skin, and he's very vindictive. That's not necessarily the best of traits, but when you know those traits exist, why insult the man knowing that he's going to counterpunch and come at you personally? This is personal for Donald Trump. He will humiliate Starmer by the time this is finished. This is why you see Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, and Tusk over in Poland, both backing away, saying, whoa, we think we want to praise Donald Trump. They're taking a page out of President Putin's book. Let's talk about the meeting that Starmer had with Trump right prior to that, where Trump embarrassed him, humiliated him, not once, but twice. The first time when he interrupted him and said, you think you can beat the Russians by yourself? And the entire press room laughed, because The UK is a joke, a literal joke. And then later on, when Starmer tried to intercede on behalf of Canada, Trump just shut him. I said, that's enough. That's enough. Shut up. You're done. And shut him up right there on the spot. Starmer also stuttered around saying that the UK is ready to back up the security of Ukraine with boots on the ground and planes in the air. But then he turned around and said, but we have to be backed up by the United States, which means it isn't going to happen because we're not going to back that up. France immediately ran away from that. So did Poland. So did everybody else. Starmer is sitting there alone. Starmer's a nobody, a nothing. And he knows it. This is just political posturing that's taking place here. Put something else that Starmer didn't mention. The British signed this deal, a $100 billion deal or something with the Ukrainians about the minerals, the same ones that Trump wanted to sign a deal for. And you're probably asking yourself, how can the Ukrainians sign 2 deals? They can't. I will make this prediction. When this is all said and done, the British deal will be canceled in totality. And whatever is the Ukrainian government will sign a mineral deal with the United States, with Donald Trump. What was the first thing that Putin did when Trump got elected? He didn't pay attention to the idiocy coming from Kellogg or the stupidity coming from Trump himself. He said, Donald Trump is a great man, a brave man, a man who withstood fire, who stood the test. He said nothing but positive things about Trump. And that plays well to Trump. That means that Trump is, I'm willing to listen to this guy, to talk to this guy. But when you come out, as Starmer has done, saying that Donald Trump is a stupid man, an idiot who Europe must actively conspire against, Trump doesn't forget this. He has a memory like an elephant, and he will not forget and he will not forgive. So they're all in a panic right now. They're desperate to keep the United States in, but they've committed so much political capital to this Ukraine fiasco. But the hilarious part now is having them all say, you got to go back and apologize. You got to go back and apologize. What I do know is that the British, the French, and everybody else were talking very big when they assembled this emergency summit about the need for an independent European security and military. And when they left, they're all going, we got to really work harder to make NATO. We have to pay our fair share so the United States sticks with NATO. We don't want the United States to leave NATO. We need to work with America, because the reality is once they all sat down there and when the cameras are off, they all turn around and went, y'all got a plan? I don't have. What happens if America leaves? We can't let America leave. America pays for this whole thing. We can't function without America. And then if we really irritate them, they'll shut our economy down. What happens if they put sanctions on us? Europe is going to counter-sanction us. That isn't going to happen. There's nothing the United States or NATO can do to change that outcome. Russia has achieved dominance and is exploiting this dominance as we speak. And every day that goes by, this dominance gets greater and greater. So eventually the Ukrainian armed forces are going to crack. This war ends when this war ends, meaning that Ukraine will have to accept the reality that it has been defeated. And as the defeated nation, it will have to make certain concessions. Now, Ukraine can be artificially stimulated to continue this fight by the continued provision of weapons, etc., but it's not enough. Just remind everybody that we're at this point 3+ years into this conflict where the United States and Europe have poured in hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assistance, including the most modern technology imaginable, top-of-the-line NATO equipment to Ukraine, and they're still losing. I think the goal of the Trump administration is to get a ceasefire and conflict termination before that happens. But the Russians know one thing for certain. No matter what happens, they're going to win. They're either going to win at the negotiating table or they're going to win on the battlefield. But there's no circumstance here where Russia comes out the loser. So I think Russia is more inclined to be supportive of the American posturing when it comes to the resources of Ukraine than they will be with the British, who just went out and negotiated without coordinating with anybody. It's still a secret agreement. We don't know exactly what was agreed to. But I will tell you this, that it has no weight under international law, and it will be unenforceable. And the British will never see that contract brought to fruition, because between the United States and Russia, that contract will be declared null and void. Reality. Trump just can't come in and say, Trump, first of all, is signing a deal with the Ukrainians that I think overlaps on the British deal. So it's not just the Russians are saying the British deal no longer has me. Trump's going to be saying the same thing. The difference is that Trump is talking with the Russians via Kirill Dmitriev about a broader economic cooperation that could include the United States helping Russia exploit its $7 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. NATO doesn't buy tanks. NATO doesn't buy aircraft. NATO doesn't buy artillery pieces. NATO doesn't buy artillery shells. That's the responsibility of sovereign states. And so whatever scheme the British and the French are cooking up, it's not bypassing NATO. NATO was never involved in it. This is a unilateral decision made by the two nations independent of NATO. When we speak of NATO funding, we're not talking about the defense budgets of the sovereign states. That's not NATO funding. NATO funding is the percentage of national treasury that is allocated to each nation to keep NATO functioning civilly. NATO has a number of civil programs to keep the secretariat functioning, pay the salary of NATO employees, and then certain costs that are associated with shared military spending to ensure that there's compatibility, et cetera. But I do want to point out that the methodology being considered by Europe to borrow from itself 800 billion euro, there is a precedent in the last 2 years of this model, and it's not a good model. The Germans in 2022 talked about spending 100 billion euro to a one-time expenditure to get the German army up out of the doldrums, become this lethal fighting force. Maybe they should have consulted with an accountant beforehand, because my understanding is that the Germans borrowed this money from themselves at a 14% interest rate. And almost immediately upon having that money allocated, they had to begin making interest rate payments. And by the end of the first year, without any weapons being procured, they were down to about between 50 and 60 billion euros that were usable. The rest was already allocated to pay back the loan, the interest rates, et cetera. And the longer they go with this, the more the purchasing power shrinks. And again, the expense of carrying this European-only arsenal, they're going to be paying premium prices for this. There won't be discounts. And at the end of the day, nothing's going to happen that's positive. In fact, it will make Europe weaker, just like Germany became weaker by allocating this $100 billion, because the $100 billion didn't accomplish anything. I've used this analogy before, but I'll use it again. If I have $20,000 and I want to make investments in my home's 50 years old, could use a new roof, could use get rid of that 50-year-old linoleum in the kitchen and maybe put down some nice tiles. The windows, we got 50-year-old windows, which means there's a lot of leaking and inefficiency there. We'd like to replace those. So we have this 20,000, and we want to use it to bring our home up to speed. You think my 20,000 is going to cover that? What happens when I begin to initiate the renovations necessary to take care of a fundamentally deficient home? I start tearing out the ceiling, tearing out the roof. And so I've torn down the house, and now I bring my 20 grand, and it doesn't even begin to start. It's done in a week. And all I have now is a torn up house and broken. This is what's going to happen to Europe. This is what's going to happen. It's not 800 billion euro. If you're dealing with a 14% interest rate, I think that's the loan terms that they're talking about. This 800 billion is going to be reduced to 620 billion right off the bat, drop it down to maybe a little over 500 billion by the time fall year's end comes around. So it ain't 800 billion. It's going to be significantly less than that. Your troops are confined to barracks. You stop doing bayonet training. Hell, you stop doing any meaningful training at all. Your tanks stay in because you're not going to fight large-scale tank warfare. There's no reason to bring 54 tanks out on the Grafenberg battlefield to work on getting battalions to cooperate with battalions. You may bring out 14 tanks to work with an infantry battalion in a peacekeeping scenario that was replicated, that you saw play out in Yugoslavia. But that's it. That's not high-intensity conflict. You worry more about medical evacuation than you do about closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower maneuver. You lose your focus, you lose your edge, and that's where NATO is today. Europe, NATO was constructed with the Cold War in mind. All of the infrastructure for NATO goes back to justifications that were created during the Cold War to justify large standing armies ready on a moment's notice to respond to a Soviet incursion, to go from 0 to 60 in a blink of an eye, 24/7, every day of the year. Then the Cold War ended, and the justification for that went away. So what did they do? They stopped maintaining their armies. Their armies aren't ready to fight at a moment's notice. They took them to the garrison There was no more training for high-intensity land warfare because that was supposed to be a thing of the past. But they maintained this infrastructure, this architecture. But instead of being cutting edge, ready to fight a war, it became a sinecure. You went to NATO for a career, and you got involved in the logistics groups, and you got involved in think tanks, and you got involved in conceptualizing a new role for NATO in the world. Today, you're doing everything but preparing to fight a war. So when you have a president on that trajectory meeting, that's the American president, meeting a Ukrainian president on his trajectory, and you bring them together, this is the inevitable outcome. Ukraine and the United States are on two fundamentally opposed trajectories. Ukraine is on a path towards committing some sort of national suicide on behalf of a Europe that is rediscovering its warmongering past. And the United States is a superpower, fully aware of the role that we have played in promoting conflict in the world these past decades, and finally having a president willing to identify the root causes of this urge for conflict-based hegemony and is actively seeking to deconstruct it. But Zelensky is more than just the failure of an individual. He's the failure of a nation, the nation of Ukraine, which is an artificial nation. So that's the other thing we have to recognize. The flaw isn't just Zelensky. The flaw is the national construct, the flaw that is Europe. Europe is a fundamentally diseased continent. Its history proves this over and over again. Napoleonic Wars. What do you think that was? World War I, World War II, the Balkan conflict, the war in Ukraine. It's part of the same diseased culture of Europe that cannot tolerate peace. Europe is a continent incapable of tolerating peace. Europe must have war. And because America was largely derived from European roots, we inherited that mindset. And we have tragically, over the course of many decades, been a nation at war with the world because the only way to promote American hegemony was to do it through the tool of conflict. So this war means more to you than any other conflict out there right now. And so we have a president who says he wants to bring an end to this. I'd like to believe the world should be trying to give him a chance. And so this isn't a perfect president. America is not a perfect nation, and our policies are not perfect. But what I ask people to do when we speak of Ukraine is to become singularly focused on Ukraine for the moment. You have never witnessed a moment like that. The fact is, Ukraine is a symptom. It's not the disease. It's a symptom of the larger problem of how America interfaces with the world. Because we have a tendency, all of us, all observers have a tendency to become singularly focused on the drama playing out in front of us. And what we saw playing out live on TV was the most dramatic thing we've seen in the world of diplomacy ever. You just don't meet with the Russian president, just like you just don't meet with the American president. When you meet with heads of state of this caliber, there has to be a reason. His time is valuable. Why is he going to allocate time to Steve Witkoff to talk about Mark Fogel? Nope. It's because he wants to take advantage of Witkoff's access to Trump to receive a message and to send a message. And whatever conversation they had resonated greatly. Witkoff went back the very next day. Trump has a 90-minute phone call with Vladimir Putin. I bring this up again because if you're acting as if what we're hearing from Putin today is the first time he's considered Donald Trump's position, you're wrong. You're fundamentally wrong. He heard Donald Trump's position back on February 12th when they had a 90-minute phone call where they exchanged ideas. This phone call didn't just happen out of the blue. They were both ready for it. They both knew what they wanted to say. They said it. They listened. And then it was followed up by a meeting in Riyadh between the Secretary of State and his counterpart, the foreign minister of Russia. It wasn't just them. Michael Waltz, National Security Advisor, met with his counterpart, Mr. Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev was there too. He was Steve Witkoff. You had three levels of connectivity there. Very detailed exchange of ideas, rather than simply Ukraine. I bring this up because what we're seeing here is theater. That's it. This is theater. And it wasn't just a meeting between Witkoff and Putin. Putin brought in somebody else, a name that nobody, unless you've been following Russia intimately, like me, nobody knew before this happened. How many people can honestly say that they knew who Kirill Dmitriev was? When they heard that name, most people went to Google and said, who the hell is Kirill Dmitriev? And why is he meeting with Steve Witkoff? What's the importance? Why is the head of Russia's sovereign investment fund meeting with the emissary of Donald Trump? Because they speak the language of international business, and because Dmitriev was setting Witkoff straight on the reality of the Russian economy, the false expectations that Trump had about certain policy directions that could put pressure on Russia. You need to set the record straight, what can be achieved and what can't be achieved, and to talk about the potential of the economic benefits of a renewed economic relationship. This is broader than just Ukraine. In fact, the conversation appeared to discuss almost everything but Ukraine. Marco Rubio, when he met with the Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh earlier this week, wasn't making a final deal. Rubio knew he wasn't making a final deal. What Rubio was doing was beginning a process, but it was a process that was hampered by several things. One, by the Ukrainians themselves. Up until we're refusing to. How can you talk about a negotiated settlement with Russia when the Constitution of Ukraine prohibits negotiation? This seems to be one of those stumbling blocks. These are fundamental things, guys. Previously, they've been dismissed as Kremlin talking points, but they're not. They're statements of fact-based reality. 2, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Just not going to happen. Boom. 3, there won't be European peacekeeping forces deployed to Ukraine. Isn't going to happen. Boom. And we can go on and on. This is the reality that was set forth. And how do you proceed when, no matter what the President of the United States said, because let's just reiterate what Trump has said is some of the foundational understandings that have been reached between the United States and Russia. A, Russia didn't start this war. There goes the entire European narrative that this is a war of Russian aggression. Russia didn't start this war. Russia was right to defend its interests. Europe was talking about humbling Russia on the battlefield, that there could be no ceasefire, that this war could only end with a Russian military defeat, and Europe was going to be the one to ensure that defeat occurred. That was the European posture. What the United States did is trap Europe. That's what happened in Riyadh. It's not about trapping the Russians. Everybody, oh, look, we outflanked the Russians. You never outflanked the Russians. How do you outflank somebody named Sergei Lavrov that's been around forever, who's been doing this forever? Vladimir Putin, who's been the leader of Russia for a quarter of a century. These Russians are better prepared. They know more. They know about themselves. They know about the world. They know about everybody. This is not their first rodeo. This is not their 5th rodeo. This is not their 1,000th rodeo. They invented the rodeo. Then Marco Rubio comes out with Mike Waltz, and they talk about, we've agreed to a 30-day ceasefire when there are certain conditions that the Ukrainians laid out, but it's a 30-day ceasefire, and the ball is in Russia's court. Those are very important words. Why? Because immediately out of every capital in Europe came a following statement, almost word for word. We love the idea of a ceasefire. Wait a minute. Didn't you just say that there can't be a ceasefire? Russia must be humbled militarily, defeated. But now Europe's saying, we love a ceasefire. It's the greatest thing. And the ball is now in Russia's court. They said it. Everybody said the same thing over and over again, which means that this was scripted. Never forget that. Ukraine is a sideshow, what Trump wants to do with China. Not military. We talked about this before. I don't believe that Trump's looking for a war with China. I think Trump's looking for an equitable solution to the tensions that exist between China and the United States. It's a whole different negotiating posture and step, and I don't want to bring it up here, except to point out that you can't do that if you're tangled up in a war in Europe. And left to their own devices, the Europeans apparently were willing to have a war with Russia. That would be problematic for the United States, because now Europe is committed to not war, but a ceasefire. Europe has said that is the best outcome. That is the outcome we want, a ceasefire. Listen to what Vladimir Putin said. Ceasefire is essential. We accept a ceasefire. We accept it. They're playing the game. Now, here's the interesting thing about the conditions. They didn't send the ball back into the Ukrainian court because they don't give a damn about the Ukrainians. They didn't send it back into the European court because Europe, frankly speaking, took themselves out of the game the moment they said, we accept the ceasefire. They went to the American court. It's the second time or the third time they've heard this. Nothing new is being presented to the Americans. Nothing new. And they will make sure that point's driven home when, as Putin said, maybe they're